Hello and welcome to Pamphlet Global. Now, there has been a very significant trip of US President Donald Trump to China. And, this basically reminds me of a 1992 trip when President George W. Bush went to, Japan. And there are quite a few similarities between the two trips. And that's what I'm going to bring out about that, what those similarities were. Because in January 1992, US President George W. Bush landed in Japan at the moment when American feared that the Tokyo's economic rise was overtaking the United States itself. Now, more than 3 decades later, in 2026, another American president, Donald Trump, has arrived in China under remarkably similar atmosphere of American anxiety. This time, the challenger is not Japan, it is China, but the stakes are pretty much the same, and in fact, they are much bigger than they were then for the Americans. But the parallels between the two visits are impossible to ignore, because in 1992, the American economy was going through an economic stress. The Japanese companies dominated the global electronics, automobiles, and manufacturing. In the United States, there was a growing fear that the Japanese economic model has outperformed the American model itself. Japanese brands were everywhere. American industries were complaining that Japan was flooding the US markets while keeping its own markets difficult for the American companies to enter. That was the atmosphere in which, George Bush went to Tokyo, and he had traveled with a large delegation of American business leaders and pushed Japan to buy more American products and open its economy further to the US companies. Now, let's look at, fast forward to 2026, and Donald Trump's China visit has unfolded under almost the same psychological backdrop. Once again, the Americans are worried about losing economic dominance in Asia. But unlike Japan in the 1990s, China is just not a manufacturing giant. China is now competing with America in artificial intelligence, semiconductors, electric vehicles, rare earth minerals, advanced military technology, and even global diplomatic influence. So just like George Bush in 1992, Trump also traveled with major American, business men who had interest, hoping to secure deals and market access inside the world's second largest economy, that is China. And just like the Bush visit, Trump's China trip has been filled with symbolism, ceremony, and carefully choreographed optics. But there is a deeper geopolitical parallel which needs to be drawn here. Because Bush's Japan visit happened right after the collapse of Soviet Union. Americans had won the Cold War, but they suddenly faced a new challenge, and that was not a military challenge, that was more of an economic challenge. Japan represented the fear that America could lose its industrial and technological edge. But with Trump's China visit has happened different circumstances. The United States is no longer dealing with a rising economic power. It is also dealing with a full spectrum rival that it sees in China, because China today is simultaneously America's biggest trading partner, its technological competitor, its Indo-Pacific military challenger, and increasingly an alternative pole of global power. That is what China is projecting itself to be. That is what makes the comparison very different and very fascinating, to be honest, because Japan in 1992 was still firmly under the American security umbrella. Tokyo had never challenged American military leadership in Asia. China is different. They have time and again. And Beijing openly wants strategic parity with Washington. It is building military power, expanding naval influence, investing in AI dominance, and positioning itself as a global power center which is independent of the West, and especially the US. And then comes the symbolism. George Bush's 1992 visit basically became a globally famous for one humiliating moment. That was during the state dinner hosted by Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa. Bush suddenly fell ill and vomited onto the Prime Minister before collapsing briefly. That incident became an international media spectacle. But politically, it also created an image, fair or unfair, to be honest, of a weakened America in front of a rising Asian power. Now compare that with China's visit of Donald Trump. There was no personal embarrassment per se, but there was no dramatic collapse of Trump happening at Pearls, but the optics still mattered. The international commentary which has been coming out of different media outlets throughout the globe is repeatedly portraying Chinese President Xi Jinping as calm, composed, and strategically confident, while Trump really appeared focused on stabilizing tensions, and trying to secure economic understandings and avoiding direct confrontation with the Chinese president. In many ways, the visual messaging was similar, and America trying to preserve its dominance while confronting the reality of an Asian ascent. But here is what history may, diverge sharply. The fear of Japan dominating the world economy today has faded. Japan entered decades of economic stagnation, and after its, asset bubble burst in the 1990s, that might not hold true for China, because unlike Japan, China has combined its economic power with its geopolitical ambition and military expansion. Beijing is not merely trying to become wealthy, it is trying to reshape the global influence itself. And that is why Trump's China visit one day may be remembered the same way Bush's Japan visit is remembered today, as a symbolic snapshot of an American president confronting the rise of a powerful Asian rival. The difference is that this time the rivalry is not just about trade deficits or car exports. It's about technology, it's about military power, it's about artificial intelligence, it's about global influence itself. And ultimately, the future shape of the international order lies on the stake here itself. Thank you.